From 27 to 32, the public pushed the value of aviation securities to somewhere between $850 million and $1 billion on the New York Stock Exchange. Yet the net total earnings of these firms were around $8 million. That's a price-to-earnings ratio of 100 to 1. And while that was not uncommon during this period, nonetheless, it was certainly unsustainable. Aviation ranked 144th in terms of the value of its products, slightly smaller than the corset industry, slightly larger than the pocketbook industry, but it was fourth in ranking of the trading of new securities. The impact of all this cash was immediate and profound. And you can see it just in aircraft production figures, which in 27 were about 2,000 airplanes, in 1928 4,300, in 29 6,200 airplanes were being built. Flush with capital, a kind of universal public enthusiasm and interest in aviation, the presence of meaningful regulation, the aviation industry just really responds immediately. And it means now that they have the money, if you will, to be able to afford to hire engineers. And this is the period when there's a start of a discussion about this emerging tension in engineering education. This is when this kind of the practical man versus the theoretical man comes into play, and it's actively discussed now in engineering journals. There is an example. One editor of a journal wrote a editorial saying that perhaps, the theorists and the practical men should come together in some kind of hybrid. And the editorial argued, for example, the need for both, suggesting that, quote, it would be a bold man who would set himself up as the infallible arbiter of what is likely to prove of practical utility and what is not. Kind of in the way that I think it was Rabi who, when it was asked at Stagg Field what the value of all this research was in physics and nuclear testing that they were doing, and his response is, I don't know, but in 50 years I'm sure you'll be able to tax it. This kind of is the kind of response to this tension that's being played out. How does it play out in the curriculum? With Guggenheim money pouring in, the statistics are impressive. In 1929, there are 1,400 aeronautical engineering students enrolled in about 14 schools around the country. It's still a time when an untrained individual could, through learning through apprenticeship and through on-site training, could succeed. But it really was side by side with the hiring of engineers trained in universities. So an example is Douglas Aircraft in 1925 hires James H. Dutch Kindleberger and Arthur Raymond. Kindleberger is self-taught. Raymond is a Caltech graduate. Both go on to have illustrious careers in aeronautical engineering design. Both become chief engineers for their company or others. But there is a belief that if you're going to transform air travel into a safe, reliable, and economic technology, that that process was going to occur as a consequence of hiring trained engineers. There are two types of programs. Minnesota, which we'll skip the next couple of slides here. And go, there's the next one that has a curriculum sheet on it, you'll see. I think it's slide 17. Yeah, that one there, thank you. There are two sheets there, but this first one is all that's necessary. The University of Minnesota is a program that gets created in 1928, 1929 as a direct consequence of the Lindbergh boom. John Ackerman, who had been born in Latvia, studied at the Royal Technical Institute in Moscow, was a pilot for the Imperial Russian Air Force, and who emigrated in 1918 to the United States, had been invited to give lectures on aircraft design at the mechanical engineering department. He had gotten an aeronautical engineering degree at Michigan in 1925 and then worked for Henry Ford in the stout metal aircraft. Hamilton Standard was the chief engineer for Mohawk Aircraft in Minneapolis. And so he gives some lectures. In 29, they establish a full 4-year degree program. It has a standard, what you see here is the curriculum for that program. Standard freshman year, sophomore you take aviation, airplane engines, aviation. You get aerodynamics your junior year. Stresses, senior you get stresses in design. What's interesting is that 29 is the first year they offer this course, and they have 229 students enrolled in this program. That's 13% of the total engineering students at Minnesota. And the numbers continue that way throughout this period. What's fascinating to me is that with the exception of Robert Gilruth, when I've reviewed their alumni list, nobody's actually working in the aeronautical industry. So you have kind of this interesting contrast. The students are clearly taking the course because they're caught up with the enthusiasm of the period, but they're doing so with no sense of job prospects. Not only are we in the Depression, and in the height of the Depression, Minneapolis has a few small aviation businesses, but Northwest really isn't there yet. It isn't a major aeronautical hub. And yet, 13% of the students are pursuing this course of study. Only electrical engineering was the largest at that time. So I found that quite fascinating. By contrast, Stanford, which received a significant Guggenheim grant, it has 5, 6, 7 students, at the most 10 students. But all of them become leading engineers in companies. So it's a sort of fascinating contrast. They use the Guggenheim money to hire 2 new professors, Elliott Reed from Langley and Alfred Niles from McCook Field. And again, what you begin to see in the Guggenheim program is almost all the people that come into the schools, the new professors, are all people that have worked in federal lab facilities. And so the locus of intellectual creativity is really seen as these federal labs, and then the technology transfers into the university. And that becomes a way in which they structure their curriculum, their sense of what problems are significant and important. And they have a 2-year graduate program. But one of the interesting things that I found about this was that the schools were pretty proud of their autonomy. E.P. Leslie, who taught at Stanford, wrote to the acting president of Stanford, Robert Swain, in June of 1930 and said, well, the Guggenheim Fund has called a conference in Washington in 1926 for all schools giving courses in aeronautical engineering. And he wrote, so far as I know, no institution represented at that conference except New York University has shown any interest or enthusiasm about this matter. There was another attempt to call another meeting in 1930, and Leslie wanted to decline, saying that he had told Clement he would not attend, that as to the proposed activities of this committee, we stood ready at any time to render such service to the industry as we had equipment and personnel fitted for, and that we felt entirely competent to render this service without any supervision or direction from anyone. That is the attitude that has been taken by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the University of Michigan, and I believe the California Institute of Technology. I see no reason why we should hitch our wagon to Professor Clement's star, and Dr. Durand agrees with me in this view. So there is some institutional rivalry going on here, and the notion that institutions did not want centralized direction from the Guggenheim Foundation. In 1933-1940, which is the last period I want to consider, I have 2 slides here of first of the Boeing 247 numbers 18 and 19, if you will. In 1930, and I just quickly put these up here just so that you can see the shape of the vehicle there. And the point is that if you closed your eyes and you said, what is an airplane to you? What is that generic mind's eye image of the airplane? This and the next one here of the, this is also a Boeing 247. And then the last one, I'm sorry. I just keep that one up. This is fine. No, I think that's it. No, that's it. What you have here is this is the image of the airplane. Today, you think substitute jet engines for it, but essentially the low wing, the monocoque, the metal structure, the position of the wings, the windows. This is your archetypal aircraft, and these airplanes in the 1933 time frame. The 247, the Douglas DC-1, 2, and 3, the Lockheed Electra appeared, and the physical appearance and performance of these aircraft were quite significantly different. They received a blizzard of publicity. They flew at a blistering speed of 3 miles a minute. And even today, the DC-3 remains one of the most celebrated aircraft in history. These airlines are the subject of many fond memories, but what I see them as historically significant is that they are the outward manifestations of enormous changes taking place within the discipline of aeronautical engineering. In the 1920s, there was a sort of substantial reconfiguration of the aeronautical engineering profession, of the traditions and practice. This kind of discussion, when I mentioned there's a tension between theory and practice in aeronautical engineering, in all aspects of engineering, there are various tensions. They're being discussed and debated. And all of that is a part of a process of forming professional identity. And ultimately, there is some stabilization that is occurring in the engineering tradition. Eric Schatzberg has written about the progress ideology of metal. Now, I'm less persuaded by his argument at this time. He writes a book about the history of the shift from the wooden to metal airplanes. But I am convinced that there are ideological commitments in technology. I believe that there are many smaller and sometimes competitive ideologies. In addition to the ideology of progress, aeronautical engineers also have had ideological commitments in varying degrees to a broad range of ideals, including safety, economy, control, materials, professional status, and corporate or institutional success. The reconfiguration of the aeronautical community mentioned earlier then represents the emergence of a new ideological coalition. In other words, as the aeronautical community matured in the late 20s, the social relations within that community changed, as did the ideas of what constituted technical practice and tradition. And this, in turn, is manifest in how these airplanes look and perform. It makes, then, the aeronautical engineering curriculum an important site for analysis. So, in the new universe, and there's one last slide here, this is a handwritten chart which appeared in a report prepared by Schatzwell-Oberg at MIT, and each of these columns here, A, B, C, D, if you will, represent different institutions. The first is Caltech, B is Stanford, so forth. What he has done is he reviewed the curriculum at all these schools in the general fields, what he calls humanities, fundamentals of math and science, engineering fields, and aeronautics, and he looked at the size of these charts is how much time each of these schools give, relatively speaking, to that particular subject. And he's doing a comprehensive analysis. The courses he drew, he did a survey of the field between this 1933-38 area. And what he came up with is that, first of all, they shared several key characteristics. That aeronautical engineering programs were planned to train men to work in engineering groups of airplane manufacturers or in maintenance sections of airlines. Second, that courses were planned to train engineers, not technicians. And third, they shared a faith in the fact that method or theory matters more. And he gives a lengthy example of why it was pointless to spend weeks and weeks studying, say, the new CAA rules for stress analysis without teaching a person how to do a stress analysis. What would happen when the engineer was confronted with a problem that didn't conform to the specifications of the government rule book? And fourth, he believed that they all shared a sense that aeronautical engineers would eventually have some sort of leadership role within their companies, and that is why that it was important to continue to have some training in humanities and other cultural subjects. That is what made engineers capable of leadership roles. What he sorts out in all of this is that this humanities portion of the curriculum averaged between 5 and 22%, with an average of 15% of a student's time. That fundamentals in math, physics, and chemistry took up between 18 and 33% of a student's curriculum. The average was 28%. And he calls these the foundations. These are these two lower categories here on this chart. And they combine to account for 33 to 52%, an average of 43% of a student's time. Different schools had a whole different series of requirements for the amount of time they spent taking courses in mechanical, civil, and electrical engineering. He noted that Western schools required students to take geology. Caltech has a geology requirement. And that in the end, the aero courses, which are up on the top, account for an average of about a quarter of the time the students spend, 23 to 32%, which was a low figure from the standpoint of the students who were very interested, or in employers who wanted to do less training, on-the-job training. But what he was kind of interested in was the fact that of that 26% of the time, aerodynamics takes up 8% of the curriculum, and the question was that too much or too little? And he proposes a variety of strategies for getting out of that. Now, what did folks make of all this? That's what somebody in the university community felt was good preparation for aeronautical engineering. In '39, Montgomery Knight from Georgia Tech does a survey of 21 manufacturers and airlines about their company's hiring requirements in their engineering departments, their shops, dispatching pilots. And the comments he got back were striking. They range from things like, must be a graduate from an accredited engineering school. We prefer a man with about 2 years postgraduate work in some leading commercial school, such as Parks Air College, Boeing School of Aeronautics, etc., having served an apprentice aeronautical engineer in some aircraft factory for several years, and accordingly qualified himself for a position with our company. However, should we have an opening for a man of engineering ability, we would consider applications of specially qualified student graduates from such colleges as the Guggenheim School of Aeronautics, Caltech, Michigan, etc. We have comments like, these days of changing philosophies and social standards, with an unfortunately critical attitude towards management and industry, it seems to me that the true picture, with naturally a few exceptions, should be impressed upon students of today. Initiative, hard work, and loyalty are still the stepping stones to promotion and success, but some of our young people do not seem to think so. My feeling is that aeronautical engineering courses are too fancy, trying to incorporate too much of the abstract science of aerodynamics, and oftentimes a graduate does not know his basic physics and mathematics. I feel that in order to use physics and mathematics in any engineering work, a graduate should be able, on any occasion, derive any of the basic formulas of analytical geometry, calculus, basic stress formulas, basic deflection formulas, and retain this knowledge at all times. Of course, some knowledge of aerodynamics is essential, but only the practical phases should be taught to four-year students, such as the basic fundamentals of static stability and performance. If we had more engineers with a real knowledge of the simple fundamentals, as I have outlined above, we would have more engineering and less system in all of our factories. And finally, one comment from the head of Pratt & Whitney's plant was, from the standpoint of the aeronautical industry, it is my belief that the greatest service our educational institutions could render would be through a more critical system of evaluating the possibilities of the students, with a view to specially classifying those thousands who are actually not suited to be real engineers. I realize that this would be a very difficult problem and would necessitate a very intimate contact between faculty and students, but it is my personal belief that the majority of those who graduate today with engineering degrees are not, never have been, and never will be true engineers. The thing about that particular review is that Knight came to the conclusion, after reviewing comments like that, was that the theoretical side of the curriculum was adequate, that, quote, schools of aeronautics have passed through an evolutionary period and now have a solid background of fundamental courses that are essential to the training of young men for the manufacture and research work. And his point is that actually, if you review all these letters, they all put in the requirements, we hire a university-trained engineer for these fields. So they have some criticism on the practical instruction side of things, and that's because most argued it took between 6 months and 3 years to make an engineer useful to the company. Knight's solution was not to abandon the theoretical side of the curriculum, but rather to change the pedagogy. Knight was a former NACA Langley researcher, and he argued for a problem-based curriculum. In other words, give students real problems. He did concede that the introduction of cooperative education programs might be somewhat simpler. One point that Knight felt strongly about was the need for faculty to be engaged with industry, perhaps doing research during their summer months. I want to conclude now, and which is to say that the balance between theory and practice in aeronautical engineering is an ongoing problem. What is the essential know-how that is required to make or do things? When we consider what we consider theory and practice has changed, though, as the context in which we think about a particular machine. In 1903, the airplane's context was that of poetry and dreams. In 1938, the airplane's context was commercial and military aviation and a sophisticated system of infrastructure. One cannot divorce engineering training from this fact. In other words, what might have been adequate training in one context was considered wholly inadequate in another. As you create a system, you need experts to make judgments, or they needed a system that needed experts to make judgments that became the basis for investment. How fast, how frequent, how safe. These are the sorts of questions that are critical to an air transportation system, and the ones that we ask engineers to supply answers to. It's not just about a machine or a single life, it's about a system, and that's why Fly and Try ended. Not because that there wasn't value in practical experience, but because the increasingly precise answers to the questions I've listed above required the imprimatur of science to give legitimacy. Thanks.
Dr. Douglas is going to take questions now.
I apologize for, we started 10 minutes late and I ran 5 minutes longer, so apologize for that. Thank you.
Any questions?
You can also talk to me informally, if that would be. Yes.
Last question. When you said legitimacy there at the end, it sounded like you had something more in mind than simply that you needed the scientific theory to make things work. That there was more than that involved somehow. Is that right, or did I misunderstand that?
No, I think that's right. I think the engineering profession had attained a kind of credibility through its emphasis on mathematics and through its identification with science, that it had the ability to render impartial and objective judgments. Now, whether or not you believe that as historians is sort of irrelevant. The society believed that and invested that in that profession. And what happens over 2 decades is a kind of movement away from hands-on, build something, see if it works, which is fine if you're doing it for yourself. But if you're going to run a system that transports thousands of people, airplanes cannot fall out of the sky. If you're going to invest money, you expect a return on that investment, and that requires a regulatory environment. It requires people to give some assurances that the vehicle will be safe, that it will do and perform according to your projections. And increasingly, the people, as the stakes get higher, as the money gets bigger and the system gets bigger, the need for answers to those questions becomes greater. And it's true, on the one hand, that the engineers some of them actually had skills to provide good answers to those questions, but many did not. I mean, many people who were graduating, which is the kind of way I read the criticism of these manufacturers, is that you got a whole bunch of people that, are reasonably good technicians, maybe after we spend 2 or 3 years training them in our factories, but not necessarily able to make good judgments. And that's what we need. That's what a real engineer is, someone who can make judgments that somebody investing money in or writing a regulatory rule around, say, how fast should aircraft land? Should it be 40 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour? There's all kinds of rationale for those decisions. What's safest? And so there are people who can supply those answers. Most of the time, though, what engineering schools seem to sell is all our graduates can supply these answers. The companies are saying, yeah, not all of them can. But it doesn't much matter. I mean, we move into a system where that's the scale is such that you continue to need people. Let me backtrack here, because I'm losing my train of thought. The bottom line is that engineers have some real skills, or a small subset have real skills. There's a larger set who are basically trading on the image of science and objectivity to market themselves as valued employees. It's not quite clear to the companies that they have that much value. Story just yet. The story changes in World War II when the production starts and the production figures skyrocket. Roosevelt comes in and says, we want to build 50,000 airplanes a year. They'd been building 12, 13, 14,000 airplanes at that point. And what they did was they said, gee, if we go around and count all the seats in these schools that are teaching aeronautical engineering courses, we aren't going to be able to produce enough graduates, even if they go to school full, 12 months out of the year, to meet the needs of 50,000 year production. It's at that point in the war that then they sort of really separate out the mathematical side of the engineering profession. And they say, okay, engineers do math and they do the science. And what we train other people to do is a whole host of paraprofessionals, draftsmen. That's when women are brought in as computers. They have tech aides. There's 3 or 4 professions that come off. And so really, to be honest, I should say that World War II is a good stopping point because that's precisely at the point that you kind of, it's clear that what engineers do, or what people consider engineers to do as special, is the science and math portion, the theoretical portion of their training. But that's enough of rambling on that subject. Yes?
In the fairly rapid growth that you showed of the commercial aviation after the 20s and 30s, you've indicated, I guess, that this forced a fairly rapid change in the curricula that was developed. Do you have a feel for whether that was kind of leading? I mean, there was obviously during that time also rapid changes in other engineering programs, mechanical, civil, and was aeronautical kind of leading the way in these changes, or were they kind of following the trend, or you have a feeling for how engineering in general was rapidly shifting from shop mentality to or the analytical, mathematical, science-based, theoretical?
They seem to be following behind somewhat. There is a kind of preset pattern of professionalization, and where one moves from a kind of craft-based tradition into a university-based tradition. And Alan writes about this in terms of the industrialization of the United States that takes place in the late 19th and early 20th century. But what you have with aeronautical engineers, and it's true with chemical engineers, is that they kind of have this model already in mind. They want to try and leapfrog the step. They want to go directly to theory. They want to go directly to engineering society. They want to go directly to metals and societies and all the things that give a discipline its shape and character. But they have to, it turns out you can't do that absent any kind of market demand for those services. And so they recapitulate the process along the way. Now, the question is, how far advanced was a field like mechanical engineering relative to aeronautical engineering? And probably, on the whole, they were in tandem. I'm sure there are fields in mechanical engineering where there was a much greater advance in terms of the theoretical side of the work. One can think of, say, theoretical work done by, say, Stephen Timoshenko at Michigan and then at Stanford on the theory of materials and on structures, which was very sophisticated. On the other hand, I'm sure there were plenty of shops where people were working essentially in an apprentice tradition. So I guess the answer is, professionally, in terms of the outward apparatus, the aeronautical engineers are behind. In terms of actual practice, they probably are running in identical step and step with the other disciplines, with the civil and mechanical, electrical fields.
I was interested in the period you're talking about with the changes with World War I,
Mm-hmm.
and I was wondering whether they're starting out as having people doing basically quality assurance to increase production, and then shifting from looking at the materials as they are and testing those, and then shifting into looking at possible materials for future projects, or are these separate groups of?
Aeronautical engineering does not get interested in production questions until the Second World War. They dabble in it in the First World War, and the aeronautical engineers actually never do anything with production, or people that call themselves aeronautical engineers. It's this trespassing of the automotive community into that field, and it didn't work very well. I mean, the production figures went up to 14,000 airplanes, but actually something like 64,000 airplanes had been used, and it was considered a travesty and a scam and waste of government money. At the time, there's a lot of muckraking journalism written about why did we fail to produce the aircraft that had been ordered, and why is it that the automotive people couldn't do for the airplane what they had done for the car. It turns out that airplanes are different from cars, and that the technology of flying machines did not lend itself very well to the kinds of Taylor systemized production techniques of scientific management that had worked so well in the automotive industry, in part because the volume was still too small. But aeronautical engineers really never cared about production figures until World War II, and then they were forced to think about them again. There's been some writing on that. Robert Ferguson did a dissertation at the University of Minnesota in which he argues that all the attention historians give to Willow Run is mistaken because Willow Run plant set up by Henry Ford is anomalous. It doesn't work like any other aircraft engineering plant. He in turn looks at Boeing and Convair and Lockheed and Douglas and compares their production techniques and methods. Each adopt a different style of producing airplanes, and he compares them. They all made B-17s. And one of the things that the Army officers in World War II discovered is that even though they were all B-17s, parts from planes built by Douglas were not interchangeable with parts built for planes for Boeing. And it's at that point there was this kind of epiphany that style of production affects affects the product, the machine that you produce. And it's at that moment that they become interested in production techniques. And that's something they care about to this day. But aeronautical engineers were really, to the extent that they were being trained and in small numbers, were focused on the design of the vehicle exclusively.
Question over there.
Yeah.
Here. You can take that.
You said at the beginning one of the unique things about aeronautical engineering was the role of the federal government in setting up, and I heard you say during the talk that one of the things the federal government did was supply an early market, and another that it did was to supply the early faculty of creative people. Are there other ways in which the government was particularly important?
Yes. Once they built Langley, this is really another chapter in the book, but once they built a place like Langley, they had a research center, and they became kind of, in certain fields, a locus for research in that field. In other words, they take the field of structures, aircraft structural mechanics. Langley became the center for intellectual creativity and activity, and people came to them for the information. It wasn't simply that the federal government was testing some concept or an airplane in a wind tunnel to determine its performance characteristics, or that it was inventing some specific technology like the NACA cowling, which then in turn got put onto aircraft around. It also became this kind of gatekeeper of information. They sponsored conferences. Every year there was an annual inspection starting in 1928 at Langley, where there were about 300 people, which were kind of all the leading engineers from industry, government, and universities attended this. And so once a year there was this kind of mixer where people came, met with each other, talked about the problems. I mean, it was a display for the NACA to say, well, this is the work we're doing, this is our latest wind tunnel we've built. What are you interested in? Is there work that you need us to do that we're not addressing? But in fact, it also performed this function of bringing people together. The NACA technical reports really were the basis for technical knowledge in the American aeronautical engineering community. And this is something Europe didn't have. They translated European works, they brought out textbooks, they republished master's and doctoral dissertations, they published the results of works in federal labs, they published the work of research they'd sponsored in universities, and all of that had a centralized distribution system. So, an average NACA technical report saw a distribution of somewhere between 8 and 15,000. And so if you were anyone in industry, any library, any university, they all got this. And so everybody has a common body of knowledge that they're working from as well. So you have a common body of knowledge, which becomes the core of most technical libraries in aeronautical engineering, at the universities. They're supplying faculty, becomes kind of postgraduate training. Before aeronautical engineering programs got started, many faculty advised their undergraduate students to go and work at Langley for a year or two and then go into industry, as a kind of way of getting more hands-on experience with airplanes. So I would say that the story is more complicated, but it plays a central role in bringing a kind of cohesion in this community and profession, and that's not something that's described. Normally people make reference, they say, well, okay, the DC-3 has the NACA cowling on it, or has this NACA airfoil on it. But more significant is this sort of role of publishing and disseminating reports, of providing personnel who then became really the most prominent educators, who then, they were teaching the students as well. Yeah.
You mentioned in your list of aeronautical schools in the early 20s, you mentioned the University of Iowa being in that list. And I wonder if that isn't the Hydraulics Institute at the University of Iowa, more in the area of hydrodynamics.
That's a really good question. I spent a lot of time, the archivist and I spent a lot of time back and forth on the phone. They do have a program starting in the late 20s, but as of 1922, we couldn't identify any program. We did look in there to see if, because a lot of aeronautical programs grow out of hydrodynamics curriculum projects or naval engineering programs, some mechanical, but we just couldn't find any reference in any catalog or course publication. That doesn't mean there wasn't a course there, but the information, just couldn't find it as of 1922.
Well, before we end tonight, we have a token of our appreciation, a HOTS t-shirt commemorating the lecture series.
Thank you very much.
Would you join me in thanking Dr. Douglas?